We're going to make a pattern. So the first thing you want to do is have your patient remove their jewelry and watches. What we'll use to make the pattern is paper towel. So we want to take the paper towel and place it underneath the patient's arm and place their hand on top of it in the position you want their hand in. So for this wrist cock-up or wrist immobilization splint, we want the thumb slightly abducted. We first want to look at the length of the splint, which should be two-thirds the length of the forearm. So here I've chosen to just make the edge of the paper towel indicate that 2/3 of length. Next, we want to mark our landmarks. The first landmark we're going to mark is the the proximal edge of the metacarpal, the 5th metacarpal. The next landmark is the proximal edge of the 2nd metacarpal, or the metacarpal for your index finger. Next, we want to mark the web space. And then the CMC joint. Now, for the CMC joint, you could mark it a little more proximally than I'm marking it here, and it would work fine. Next, we need to mark where the edge of the thenar eminence is so that the patient's thumb can move in this splint. So I'm just going to lift the patient's hand up, look where the thenar crease is, and then make a line on my pattern that begins just at the base of that crease and comes straight out. The last thing we need to do is mark the circumference of the forearm trough, and that needs to be half of the forearm. So I'm just going to hold the paper towel tautly against the patient's arm and mark halfway up to the base of the thumb on this side, and then the whole way up to that landmark I made by the 5th metacarpal on the other side. And I'm just holding that about halfway up and making my marks. Next, we need to trace the pattern. We're going to start by connecting those 2 metacarpal lines across the top and extending it. Then we're going to make a curve beginning at the web space, touching that thenar, edge of the thenar eminence, and ending at the CMC. Next, we simply connect the dots, and then we want to extend the line that began at the web space out parallel to the one we started with and make a little tab. The last thing to do is to cut the pattern out. When you're cutting, it's certainly important to get somewhat close to the edge of the pattern, but there's no need to be compulsive about it. When you're cutting paper patterns, you want to be sure that you're using paper scissors and not the splinting scissors, because that will dull the splinting scissors. Lastly, we want to fit the pattern on the patient. Be sure that it's going to be the adequate length, 2/3 of the forearm, that it's going to cover half the circumference of the forearm, that the thumb will be free to move so the thenar is free, and so that the distal edge of the splint is at the distal palmar crease so the patient's fingers can move freely.